As helpers, we're a lot more like duct tape than we are Kevlar. Kevlar is made to bounce off and repel. But what makes us good as helpers, what makes you good as missionaries, is that sticky quality, that adhesive quality that you can kind of come along and help put people back together again and care for them. But what happens over time is that some of those challenges, some of that trauma can start to stick with us, and we lose some of that adhesive quality and we start taking on those trauma symptoms for ourselves. And again, it's going to vary a lot on different factors of who you are, the people you're helping, the experience. But one of the things that we can do is to try to take steps to prevent it from happening in the first place. One of the things that we've seen in research is that team cohesion is really important in helping to prevent vicarious trauma among groups, especially among missionaries, where sometimes you may feel kind of disconnected from others or from home, or a lot of these types of situations. Another major issue is to also be practicing on continuing our faith. Sometimes we get so busy sharing our faith that we forget to also nurture our own faith. And so we want to make sure that we're cultivating our faith with a sense of resilience. And then another is to set healthy boundaries. How much do I have left in the tank? Because if you're constantly always giving, you're going to burn out. One of the things that I oftentimes try to remind myself of is that those that I serve and care for, they need help now, but they're also going to need it later. So we need to follow Christ's example of taking times of solitude, taking times of rest, spending time in community, and spending time with God.
We want to help you be the very best missionary so that you can give your very best to the people you're serving. What makes this podcast unique is it's done by missionaries for missionaries. How can we take timeless principles and apply them to our lives as missionaries? That's really our heart behind this. Welcome to this episode of the Modern Day Missionaries podcast. Today, we are pleased to welcome Dr. Jamie Aten with us. And Jamie is the co-founder of Spiritual First Aid. Get prepared, because he's got a lot of things he's a part of. He's also the founder and co-director of the Humanitarian Disaster Institute, Blanchard Chair of Humanitarian and Disaster Leadership, the co-coordinator of the Trauma Certificate Program at Wheaton College. And he is a Hurricane Katrina and a late-stage early onset cancer survivor. And as a trauma psychologist, Jamie's responded to and researched disasters and mass traumas around the globe. He's authored or edited 9 books and over 150 scholarly publications. That is a lot, Jamie. Wow. And your recent book that you wrote, that you authored, is called A Walking Disaster: What Surviving Katrina and Cancer Taught Me About Faith and Resilience. And Jamie and his work have been featured by the New York Times, the Washington Post, USA Today, Fox News, Christianity Today, you name it. He's been on it. And in 2016, he was awarded the FEMA Community Preparedness Champion Award at the White House. And he also is the co-author and co-host of the award-winning The Better Samaritan column and podcast. Jamie, thank you so much for coming on and sharing with us today.
Oh, thanks so much for having me. Really looking forward to it.
I am too. And I think viewers, listeners can probably guess by now what we're going to be talking about with your rich history of trauma and helping people who've been through it. That's what we're going to dig into, really, missionaries and global workers and their experience with trauma. But since today's topic is such a big one, we're going to just start it a little bit lighter. People have gotten to hear your professional side. Now we're going to give them a little peek into your personal side. So I've got a few questions. They're not hard to get us started. You ready for them, Jamie?
All right, I'm ready. I've had my coffee.
Okay, let's do it. What is your favorite guilty sweet or snack?
Anything that has chocolate and peanut butter. Could be ice cream, a cake, it doesn't matter, but that combination, that's what works for me.
It's pure magic. All right. How about your favorite seat on an airplane? Aisle, middle, or window?
Oh, totally aisle. So 100% aisle.
What do you like about aisle?
That I'm not in the middle or against the window.
It's
So,
pretty straightforward.
I like to be, I don't know. I always like to kind of try to, if I can, I like to try to squeeze in, some writing on the plane. And so I can at least have my left arm kind of free here and, be typing over to the side a little bit. I've probably got a number of bruises on and off from every trip from they bring the cart down the aisle. But other than that, that's why I prefer that.
worth it. I like knowing why people like the aisle because I've discovered people like it for different reasons. I like it because I have easy access to the bathroom. I can just get up
Ah,
as many times as I want. But yes, that space, that elbow room is quite nice. Now,
it
this
is.
third one I wrote before knowing the answer to the first one. So, crunchy peanut butter, creamy peanut butter, or no peanut butter. Clearly, we know now it's not no peanut butter since it's one of your
It's
favorite
all
snacks.
the above. I mean, you can't go wrong with peanut butter. So,
There you go. One of the main food groups right there.
absolutely.
I feel like all missionaries like peanut butter. And now I'm sure there's someone listening going, I don't like peanut butter. But I swear, when we would have people bring stuff down, peanut butter was a top choice. It's a thing.
It is. It's a good
So
thing.
what was one of your favorite childhood toys?
One of my favorite childhood toys. Oh, wow. I loved the, like, Hot Wheels and, like, the little monster trucks and those sorts of things. So, always loved playing with, like, little cars and trucks.
Huh? Okay. If you could instantly become an expert in something, what would it be?
Jazz history or performance. So
You
that
you
would
answered that like right off the bat. No
Oh, yeah.
hesitation.
If I remember, so I've always loved music. It's been something really, important part of me, and, going off to college, and initially I thought about being a music major, and I realized, "Oh, I'm not good enough to play professionally, but I'm also not cut out to be a band director." I'm not gonna last very long in that job. Talk about trauma, right? Uh, especially when they would hear me sing, it wasn't gonna work out for anyone. Um, and then I remember thinking like, "Oh, well, what if I became a professor of, like, jazz history?" And then found out, like, there's only, like, a handful of those jobs, like, in the country, and that's not, like, really a typical gig. So, decided to go the psychology route instead.
You know, jazz history or psychology and trauma.
Well, it's actually, for me, like, jazz and what I do now actually goes hand in hand. It's all about improv, taking things as you come, figuring out what you've got, using what you've got. In jazz, you trade fours back and forth with the other musicians. So there's the collaboration. So my students actually tease me about how many ways I work in jazz metaphors in my lectures. So I'll try not to do too much of that during our conversation here.
Feel free. Feel free. Clearly, it's a passion of yours. I love the link that you made between those two. That is fantastic. Okay, last question. What is one book you're reading right now?
So right now, I'm going back through and rereading Wendell Berry's an edited version of his essays called "The World on Fire."
I have that on my reading list. So, what you're saying is it needs to stay there and maybe move up.
It does. I love his writings, and often find those kind of like nuggets of wisdom. A while back, I was reading one of his other books, and he was talking about Amish farming and about how one of the parables he's tried to live by was one that he learned on the farm from this other Amish farmer who talked about how, my horses in the morning, they can work from sunrise to sunset, but if I work them beyond that, they're going to wear out and not be able to do the next day's work well. And so for me, that's a good reminder as I start to sometimes feel tempted to, kind of burn the oil a little bit too late on work, to always kind of remember that like there's wisdom in slowing down.
Yeah, absolutely. And we are going to reference at the end of the podcast an event coming up, the Church Mental Health Summit, where people can really learn more about those types of things in terms of keeping themselves healthy. So, but before that, let's jump into missionaries and trauma. And Jamie, can you start us off by defining trauma? Because it's become a bit of a buzzword. I hear people say it all the time, like, I'm so traumatized, or that's so trauma. And what would you say trauma is? How can we use it appropriately?
Yeah, really trauma is one of those kind of terms that's being used in a lot of different ways, and sometimes not always in a way that's really accurate. So for instance, right before we started taping, I shared with you that one of the ways that I got into trauma, I sometimes joke, is that I'm a diehard Cubs fan. That trauma, it's kind of come hand in hand. But I say that, and I actually had a friend the other day who called me up after the Cubs had this horrible loss, and he asked, "How traumatized are you?" And I just realized the same thing that you're talking about, that we start to kind of throw that word around now, maybe times that even in ways that are light. But one of the reasons that can be challenging to really figure out what trauma is because it is highly subjective. The trauma really is anything that causes us significant psychological distress. And one of the ways to be able to recognize it that we teach is often to look for the three E's. So you want to be able to kind of listen for an event that maybe somebody's gone through. You also want to listen for the effect that that event has had on them. So maybe trouble sleeping, maybe it's having nightmares, feeling withdrawn, anger, these sorts of changes. And then the last one being the emotional experience, just really like what it is that that person has gone through. Because at the end of the day, you and I might go through the same event, but one of us, it may not be traumatic and the other, it might be. So it really does depend a lot on that person and their firsthand experience.
Which is really significant that you mentioned that it's subjective because everyone's personality is so different in their past. And sometimes we'll see people who go through a traumatic experience, or at least it appears to be, and it doesn't seem to affect them. And that same person can look at others who have been genuinely traumatized and scoff or blow it off or act like, I'm fine. So why aren't you? So, how good that you're pointing it out that our experiences are different. What are some of the reasons that people might react differently to a traumatic experience?
Yeah, it's actually there's a lot of different kind of factors at play. One of them is our own physiology and psychological makeup. That some people are just have that kind of more of a grit trait to them, even from birth. Like when I think of my own kids, and one of my children, probably by the age of 2, I remember thinking like, wow, there's not going to be much that's going to get in this kiddo's way, right? There was just kind of that personality there. But it's also something that can be learned. We know that over time we can kind of like a muscle, the more that we use and practice adapting, the more flexible we can get. Another thing is our exposure to previous traumas. So the research shows that those who have experienced multiple traumas are more likely to develop future trauma. So having gone through that, many people will be at a more kind of vulnerable state in the future. Another kind of key issue here is also the type of social support that we have around us, that the types of resources that we have can make all the difference.
Mm. And now, Jamie, you helped people through Hurricane Katrina. So you saw a variety of people go through a really intense situation. What were some of the ways that you saw people react differently to that traumatic experience?
I think one of the most important things that I learned from that was truly that importance of coming together. That the Sunday after Katrina, many people referred to it as Slab Sunday. And the reason for that was that that was in many cases all that was left, that the buildings were completely wiped out. The debris was everywhere. And so I'm talking about in South Mississippi. So the way things looked in New Orleans and Mississippi looked very different visually. But in Mississippi, it was almost like a bomb had gone off and just kind of wiped everything out. And yet at the same time, people still came together where their physical churches had been on that Sunday morning afterwards and worshiped together. That they
Mhm.
came and they laughed, they cried with one another, they shared time with one another. And it's just such a valuable part of resilience. And we've seen that in studies that we've done all over the world.
Now, missionaries are helping people through traumatic experiences all the time. Obviously, every missionary is different because we're all serving in different areas in different capacities. But I would say the majority of missionaries are encountering people in really difficult situations. Can you talk for a second about vicarious trauma?
Mm. Yeah, and I think you're right. That is really important for missionaries because, in many ways, missionaries are on the front lines of trauma. And I heard Diane Langberg once. I was talking with her, and she shared about how, in many ways, that trauma is one of the new mission fields. And so, we've
Oh.
seen that in our own work. For instance, like working in Japan, that one of the very first groups of Christians to respond on the ground were missionaries, and we've seen that type of response play out over and over because oftentimes you're working in very vulnerable areas and with vulnerable people. But as a result of that, that also puts us sometimes in harm's way as well, that we're not immune to it. And so vicarious trauma is what happens sometimes when we actually develop symptoms of trauma, but not necessarily because of our own experience firsthand, but rather because of the trauma from someone else. I had a chaplain once who shared with me that as helpers, we're a lot more like duct tape than we are Kevlar, right? The Kevlar is made to bounce off and repel. But what makes us good as helpers, what makes you good as missionaries is that sticky quality, that adhesive quality that you can kind of come along and help put people back together again and care for them. But what happens over time is that some of those challenges, some of that trauma can start to stick with us. And we lose some of that adhesive quality and we start taking on those trauma symptoms for ourselves.
Wow. And what are some of the ways then that people can keep that, or can you even keep that from sticking to you? Or if it does, what do you do in that type of scenario?
Yeah, and again, it's gonna vary a lot on different factors of who you are, the people you're helping, the experience. There's just so many moving pieces there. But one of the things that we can do is to try to take steps to prevent it from happening in the first place. And one of the things that we've seen in research is that team cohesion is really important in helping to prevent vicarious trauma among groups, especially among missionaries, where sometimes you may feel kind of disconnected from others or from home or a lot of these types of situations. And then another major issue is to also be practicing on continuing our faith. That sometimes we get so busy sharing our faith that we forget to also nurture our own faith. And so we want to make sure that we're cultivating our faith with a sense of resilience. And then another is to set healthy boundaries. And I know that can be so hard, but you have to kind of start to learn, how much do I have left in the tank? Because if you're constantly always giving, you're going to burn out. And when that happens, one of the things that I oftentimes try to remind myself of is that those that I serve and care for, they need help now, but they're also going to need it later. So we need to follow Christ's example of taking times of solitude, taking times of rest, spending time in community, and spending time with God.
Question for you. There is, thought of this as you were talking, there's this perspective among missionaries. Sometimes we referenced it a little bit earlier, but there's this like, I'm a missionary, so I should toughen up and I should muscle through. I think that still exists among a lot of people. What
Mm.
happens if that's the response that we take, whether it's experiencing vicarious trauma, someone else experiencing our own trauma? What happens if we just tough it up and muscle through?
If you try to tough it up and muscle through, you're going to accomplish the exact opposite of what you're trying to do. And so now there is that piece that there is value sometimes of trying to push through, and there are times that you just have to push through, right? Like you're gonna find yourself in
Yeah.
situations. Um, but again, it's one of the ways that I try to approach it, and our team at the Institute tries to approach this topic, is to really think about it more in life rhythms rather than having perfect life balance, right? So, like, when I hear somebody say, "Oh, you have to live a balanced life," I don't know about you, but, like, my eye starts to twitch and I start to tune them out a little bit. And part of that is
Yeah.
because I was listening to this radio program one day, and they were interviewing all these different like well-being and health experts and everything. And each of them were telling you, this is what you need to do to live a healthy, balanced life. So I went back and I wrote up what all those activities were, and then I did the math. So I'm sorry, I'm a researcher. So did the math to figure out how long if I were to do all of those things I just listened to would take, and it was more than 24 hours, right? And so our life often doesn't work in a perfect system. And
Right.
so instead, I like to think of it as a little bit like on a surfboard that it's okay sometimes to ride kind of a crest of busyness, but then you also have to know your limits, which takes humility to know when you maybe need to go into some shallow water for a while or even to get completely out of the water and spend some time on that beach.
Which is actually so much more doable. Like you said, who has ever really achieved a balanced life? Especially you look at somebody who lives overseas or is working in a mission capacity. We live a life where rhythms are especially difficult
Mm.
because there are mission teams visiting, there are crisis situations. The nature of our work is that it's constantly varying. And
Yes.
so a rhythm makes a lot more sense than balance because you can have an underlying rhythm of your core things that you know you need to do to take care of yourself. But like you said, there's moments where you just got to ride that wave and go,
Hmm.
Lord, help me hang on to the surfboard.
Right. And also, it's a good idea to sometimes surf in pairs or in groups, right? Like, don't go
Yes.
out into those deep waters on your own. Make sure you have the right support.
Okay, so let's say more about what is a healthy trauma response. Again, whether it's ours, whether it's someone else's. You've mentioned community several times. So that's certainly part of a healthy trauma response. What would be some
Yeah, so
other factors?
you can kind of think of, when we talk about resilience, we often talk about it in a very narrow way. So I kind of want to challenge those who are listening to think about it in a broader perspective. We often talk about resilience as being kind of like this beach ball that when it's pushed underwater and there's pressure and then we bounce back to normal. But one of the things that I've noticed from the disasters and mass traumas that I've worked on, and even from my own life, especially my cancer experience, is that sometimes we don't just bounce back. When I think about that in my own life, like with cancer, it took me over a year just to get back to some basic, kind of baseline of, my physiology, my psychology, my spiritual life. It took me a while to get back on my feet again. And one of the perspectives, one is that, we've already talked about community resilience, that having that support around us. So you can almost think of it as like a car. So what happens, right? If one of the wheels is got a hole in it or a flat, it's going to bring the whole thing to a scratching halt. And that's the same with us when it comes to resilience. So we want to make sure we got all four of these tires all filled up that I'm about to share about. One, community resilience. The other is resilience itself, that individual resilience, our ability to adapt and bounce back. But then we also need to make sure that we have grit, and grit is that kind of stick to itiveness, that kind of pushing through things. But if we don't have this last wheel, we're going to have problems. And that last wheel is spiritual fortitude.
Mm.
And spiritual fortitude is what allows us to endure hardships, to be able to still do good in the midst of adversity, and to be able to find meaning in our suffering. That spiritual fortitude, one of the ways that we talk about it in our research is that it helps us to really metabolize suffering. And so the reason why we need to have that spiritual fortitude is that without it, we're likely going to overinflate, right? We have just the exact opposite problem as getting, flat because you ran over a nail and you have a hole. If you overinflate, you're going to get the same result and have a flat. But
Mm.
that's what happens without spiritual fortitude. It gives us the wisdom to know when to stop airing up the tire, so to speak, in the others.
Yes. Oh, I love that because you painted a picture, four wheels. Everybody can picture the wheels on the car. Okay, so how can a missionary know if what they're going through personally is trauma or if it's just the normal stress and crises we always seem to deal with? And why is it so important to identify if it's trauma or if it's something else?
Yeah, that's a great question. And so, in terms of how to kind of know if it's trauma or not, one of the kind of first rules of thumb is to figure out, does it start to interfere with your everyday life? So, what I'm kind of doing here is we're going to kind of start kind of like a game of Plinko, right? That we start at the top and we kind of bounce our way down until we get to the end. So, one of the first indicators that you know something is off is when you hit that first kind of pull there on the Plinko board and it starts to bounce you around and you realize that my everyday life, I'm just not functioning how I used to do. So maybe it's my relationships, how I do at work. It could be, really anything. Now, as we kind of go a little bit further along, bouncing around on the Plinko board and start to narrow down, is this trauma or not? Then we start to look at how's it impacting my overall functioning. So starting to look for things like where you're starting to have maybe kind of feeling jumpy on a regular basis because often a key symptom is that our physiology kind of goes into hyperdrive, right? And so if you're constantly feeling jumpy all the time, that might be an indicator likely to start withdrawing more from others, easily getting angered or upset, and also likely to have flashbacks is a very common symptom. Now, when we talk about flashbacks, for some people, that will be like they're back in that moment of the trauma, right? Like the type of experiences that maybe we've seen portrayed in like a war movie, for example. But for most people that'll have trauma, that kind of traumatic flashback is actually a little bit more of like an intrusive thought, or you could kind of think about it as almost like an augmented reality experience. I don't know if you ever saw, there used to be this app, I don't know if it's still around for cell phones where people would play Pokemon and they'd be out in public somewhere. And so I have three kids. So this is how I know
I've
this. So,
heard of it,
so
but I would never tried it
yeah.
out.
So, you
Yeah.
got the cell phone out and, you could be, here in this room and it would kind of over a Pokemon character, through the screen. So the Pokemon's not really there. You can see through it, it's transparent, but you still kind of see some hints that it's there, even though it's not real. And for a lot of people, that's actually what a flashback will be like.
Wow, what a great way of describing it. I've never heard it that way, and that makes more sense. It sounds more realistic than some of the other explanations that I've heard.
Yeah, and
And
for some people, they really will have that full immersion experience where it does like, and maybe even to the point where they disassociate some of not even being aware of where they are in that moment.
yeah, but you've given some other options of how people might experience that. So you kind of explained a little bit how a missionary can know the difference. Why is that so important for them to identify? And then what would their next step be? Just again, if people are listening going, I am feeling, let's say they're feeling it in their body. They're listening to you going, "Oh my gosh, I'm realizing this is more than stress."
Mhm.
Um, why is it important to name that? And then what should my next step be?
Well, if we try to fix a problem without the correct tools, we're probably not going to actually get to the heart of what's actually going on. You could kind of think about it a little bit like going back to the car illustration, right? Like if you went to a mechanic, you would want them to actually pop open the hood. You wouldn't want them just to be able to like kind of come over and like walk the tires and be like, okay, here's the problem. This is what we're going to do. No, you want them to open up that hood, get under the car, check everything out so they actually fix the problem. So you don't have to go back in a day or two when the engine light comes back on. And if we don't really know what the cause is of what's happening, we're unlikely to be able to make long term change. So, being able to differentiate too between trauma and other types of events is also going to dictate what types of strategies we can use. They're going to be most effective. So, granted, there's going to be a lot of interventions or ways that we can cope that will help across the board of whatever struggles we have. But trauma is a very unique, particular type of issue. So, let me give you just one example here that versus say trauma versus say depression, for example. Individuals who are depressed, one of the things that we know in talk therapy, for example, is that as you share about it and you start to open up and process it, that's one of the ways that we get better. But with trauma, what I've seen sometimes is that people try to approach it in the same way and it can cause harm. So let me give you an example. Like if you ended up having a wound and you went to the doctor and asked them to help, patch up this or heal this wound, you're not going to ask them to open it up and to be able to start digging in if you know that they don't have a way to patch it up afterwards. But if we ask people to talk about their trauma before they're actually ready and try to push them before they're ready, it's like opening up a wound without having any way to bandage it.
Wow, that's really significant. So, what can someone do if, again, they're sensing this and they're feeling this? What would you recommend as the next step for a missionary global worker?
Yeah, I think for a missionary who's going through this, to talk to someone that you trust. So whether that's another missionary, somebody in your community, somebody back home, reach out. You don't have to go through this alone. And know that you truly aren't. 70% of adults will experience a dramatic event at least once in their life. So
Wow.
this is something that's a lot more common than what people realize. And so reach out, let somebody know that you're struggling, and try to find additional resources or professional services.
And is that 70% stat a US stat?
No, that's a global stat.
That's a global stat.
Mhm.
Wow. And I would wonder if in certain countries that would be higher just because, simply political unrest or economic disruptions or things people have been through. And so
Oh,
we've talked,
absolutely.
yeah, and that's where a lot of these people are probably going to be finding themselves, these missionaries. So we've talked a little bit about how they can take care of themselves when they've been through either trauma or vicarious trauma. What are a few ways they could help somebody who has gone through that, the people they're serving?
It's a great question. In fact, that's something that I've spent my career trying to understand. How do we actually help without causing additional harm? And how do we help them in a way that's biblical, yet informed by research and trauma informed? And so one of the
Exactly.
things,
And most missionaries are not coming in as psychologists. They're coming in just as, pastors or regular people who don't have the type of training you do. And so a lot of people will I shouldn't say a lot of people, some people might try and go in and use psychological techniques or, borrow things from psychology and use it inappropriately. So, how can we help people in an appropriate way with the level of training that we have?
Well, one of the things that my colleague Kent Anna and I did was that we founded spiritual first aid to really be able to help take that guesswork out of helping and to equip frontline helpers. So you don't have to be a psychologist to make a difference. And so don't underestimate how kind of small actions can really make a big difference for people. And so in the spiritual first aid certificate course that people can take on demand on their own or in groups, so we have it set up where you can do it with a facilitator in your own community or online. And we teach what we call in spiritual first aid the Blessed CPR Framework. And so it's really kind of a basic 5-step process. The first is that we want to prepare to help and care by walking with humility. We don't want to assume we know what the other person needs, and we want to make sure that we view them as the expert of their own needs and that we come across and walk with them kind of through this. You could kind of think of it as a path that we call the trauma informed path. So we're going to walk humbly with people through their experience. And then the next thing that we're going to do after we've prepared, and part of that is also knowing our motivation, which humility helps us to better understand, make sure we're helping for the right reasons. Then the next step is to use blessed triage. So you've probably heard the term triage, like in a medical setting where you're sorting out the problems. Well, that's what you're going to do here, but with spiritual and emotional care, that you're going to listen for the 5 blessed needs, is what we call them. And these are the 5 core needs our research shows that when they go unmet are more likely to cause psychological and emotional distress. And those blessed needs stand for biological, livelihood, emotional, social, and spiritual needs. So you don't have to be a psychologist or have a diagnostic statistical manual like what I have in my work office, which is, by the way, I think about that thick, and it's got hundreds of you don't
Wow.
have to know all of those things to help someone. So instead, think of it kind of like that Plinko board that I talked about earlier, that you're listening for those 5 blessed needs that are going unmet. And we're going to triage them and work with that person to find out of all of these problems, what's the main one or what's the most pressing that can help you with right now. And then the next step is the C in Bless CPR, and that's care with practical presence. Yeah, I just really want you to know that your presence says more than any words you might offer. So when you feel like you don't know what to say, you're afraid, maybe you're like me and highly likely prone to put your foot in the mouth, then don't say anything. Just be with that person, set with them in that pain. And then the reason why we call it practical presence, you've probably heard ministry of presence, but the reason why we chose that language was we interviewed about 30 different experienced chaplains that have all been doing disaster response and trauma response for about 30 years apiece. And as we listened to their stories, we realized it was ministry of presence, but there was a slight different angle. They often referred to what they did as water bottle ministry, that there was this sense of practical assistance that you want to help that person with their spiritual and emotional struggles. But if they're not ready yet, maybe it starts with meeting that basic need of they need a glass of water. So start with those needs, and you can think about those needs as kind of like a Rubik's cube, that they're all interconnected. We have seen people's problems where, they come to us and you could probably fill up each little box of the Rubik's cube with a different problem. Well, how do you know where to start? When you figure out that most pressing one and you push on that one little tile, what happens with that Rubik cube? It all starts to shift everything, right? Because it's all interconnected. So we start then by identifying that blessed need and then carrying with it with practical presence. And then the next step, the P, is to provide coping practices. So in the course, we teach about 50 different interventions that are very basic, but all research based, but also scripturally informed. And then the next step, the last of Bless CPR, that final R, stands for refer and resource. So sometimes we feel like if we refer someone that we're not doing our job or maybe we didn't do enough. But what we found in our research is that referring or resourcing others is actually one of the most important actions we can take to helping others. So it's knowing that those limitations, like what you were saying. And you can think of those limitations a little bit like a hot pack or a cold pack. So spiritual first aid is like a cold pack. If you sprain your ankle, and you get ice on it right away, it stabilizes it, prevents that injury from getting worse. But then later, if it continues to hurt, it continues to be chronic, that's when you need a hot pack or counseling, something that really kind of works in and gets into that issue even more deeply.
Jamie, you are the analogy king. You have painted so many pictures today, which for me is fantastic. I mean, we got tires, we got water bottles, we got hot packs. There were at least like three other ones in there. Um, that was so deeply practical too. I appreciate that because I think it recognizes that God is able to use us right where we're at. We don't need to limit ourselves and say, I can't help because I don't have this professional designation or this educational degree. And yet it also acknowledges that there are ways in which we can learn more and we can make ourselves better able to help people. And then ultimately, that last point, like you said, recognize when we've hit our limits and it's time to refer on to a different place. So that was great. I hope that everybody looks into that and finds out more about that. Spiritual first aid is what you called it, right?
Right. And you can find out more at spiritualfirstaid.org.
Perfect. Okay, there's a place for people to jump in. And then lastly, there is a free online event coming up that we want people to know about on October 10th. Would you let everybody know about that as well?
Yes, I'm so excited about this. So, our team at Spiritual First Aid is collaborating with Hope Made Strong as well as Biola School of Psychology with their Flourishing Congregations program there. And we're going to be collaborating on the Church Mental Health Summit. So, last year we had over 5,000 people that from all over the world. I think it was over 110 different countries. And we're expecting even more people to join into this free event. So, it's an online, so you can join from wherever you are, and we have a lot of different tracks there. And so some of it focuses on church leadership. There's a whole global health track, which would be perfect for missionaries. So come listen to that for sure. But there's just so many incredible speakers, a track for everyone. And I just want you to know that the founder, Laura Howe, who started this, is amazing, and you will not be disappointed by coming to this.
It is the truth. I've had some great conversations with Laura, and her heart behind all of this is incredible. And like you mentioned, there's a whole track that is specifically for global missions. And so, for everybody listening, what I appreciate is that it's acknowledging the role that mental health plays around the world, not just in the US. And so we've got all kinds of speakers. Jamie, you're going to be speaking. So, I mean, that's a plug right there because I know everybody enjoyed hearing from you today. Modern Day is actually one of the sponsors as well. We're thrilled to get behind it. So, our president, Elias, and I will be speaking. We've got Christy Galtier, John Townsend, Dr. Anita Phillips, Kay Warren, Tony Collier, and so many more. And like you said, it's completely free. So for people who are interested in that, we will be posting a link that you can sign up on through our show notes and podcast website. But Jamie and I are excited about this because this is going to offer even more tools, even more resources to get yourself healthy, to get the people that you serve healthy. And it's going to be a great event. So we hope that you come join us for it. And Jamie, thank you. This was such a fantastic conversation. Engaging, it was practical, pictorial, I have to say. And I think really helpful for everybody who listened. So for everybody else, we will see you on our next episode.